And today you are joining us maybe on Facebook. You've been scrolling through and you happen to see my face pop up. This is Ask the Dietitian. We do this once a month. We pick a topic at Cancer Wellness Center, and then we allow our participants to ask questions related to the topic. They submit them ahead of time. I put together a PowerPoint presentation, and I have 45 minutes, now less than that, to answer all of the great questions that are submitted. We have a lot of great programming coming up at Cancer Wellness Center, especially related to the nutrition programs. So please take a look at our calendar on the website, follow us on social, do all the things. Comment if you're watching on Facebook, because we'd like to see that you're participating. We like to engage with our audience. When you register for programs like mine, like this one today, you have access to the content that I create. So we get to share that with you. So that includes the PowerPoint for today. We chose a timely topic. It's all about saturated fats. If you haven't seen anything in the media related to the dietary guidelines of Americans or saturated fat, I'm here to raise awareness around that. Or maybe potentially you have seen that information. I'm here to hopefully set the record straight for you today. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and share my PowerPoint presentation. I thank you all for watching. If you are watching this recorded on YouTube, good for you because you found us. And if you're catching us late or you have to leave early, have no fear because we record this and we put it on our YouTube channel. So please take a look at that as well. And you can subscribe to that as well if you want. I'm going to share my PowerPoint. Again, thank you for being here. We appreciate your time and attention to empower yourself and to learn about how nutrition and healthy eating can really help you no matter where you are in the continuum of your cancer care. So as I shared, this program is Ask the Dietitian. This month's topic is saturated fat. And we have new dietary guidelines of Americans. I don't know if you've seen this infographic that was recently released, I think 2 days ago. And so they also have a brand new spanking website. This is the new pyramid. And nutrition experts and professionals like myself, we're still sort of digesting this information, pun intended. And if you don't remember, I want to also jog your memory about this. This is from 1992, but since 1980, we've been giving dietary guidelines for Americans. And a lot of what that information is a review of evidence from a scientific committee. Since 1980, these guidelines really do help inform policy making decisions, and also for some of our federally funded nutrition programs. A lot of what's in these guidelines are translated into that. Now, as I shared, nutrition experts are sort of digesting this information because we did away with this pyramid, but here we are again. And it's like this inverted pyramid, and the image itself is sort of confusing at first glance. If you ask me, are we supposed to eat more of what's on top, I think? And it looks like a lot of protein, a lot of dairy, a lot of quote unquote healthy fats, but I do see whole milk. I do see a big stick of butter in there. I don't know. I'm not really sure what's going on here. So I did have the opportunity to skim through the scientific report, which was over 400 pages, but I still haven't really digested all of that. So let's see what unfolds in the next couple of weeks about all of this information and what we can do with it. Now, on the agenda, I'm going to list the questions that were submitted related to saturated fat, provide my answers to the best of my ability, and then offer some resources along the way, and then, of course, at the conclusion of the presentation. So we're going to start here. It just makes the most sense to start here. What are saturated fats? Where are they found? Should they be avoided at all costs? Are all saturated fats bad? So before I even dive into the answers for those questions, what I do want to share is this is what makes nutrition complicated, especially when we attempt to research it, because we can't reduce food to one single nutrient, right? Because we don't eat that way. We eat a mix of things inside a mix of food in our meals within our day, right? So even just for our oils and our solid fats, each of them, as you see listed here with these like little bar graphs, they have a mix of different types of fat in them as well, right? So when we look at oils, if we just take something like olive oil, it is primarily a monounsaturated fat. as you see with the yellow there, but there is a little bit of polyunsaturated fat, and then there also is a little bit of saturated fat in olive oil. Did you know that? But we sort of classify olive oil as a monounsaturated fat because that's primarily the type of fat that's inside of it. Now, if we look at some of our solid fats, let's just go right down to coconut oil, and this might be a surprise to some of you too. It is primarily a saturated fat. 91% of the fats inside of it are saturated, and then 7% are mono and 2% are polyunsaturated fat. Now, there are different types of fatty acids even within the different types of fats that you see here, and this is where it gets really complicated. And the science is sort of just still exploring all of this. Even with the release of the new dietary guidelines, we still need to learn a lot more. So what I'm going to provide for you today is what we know up until this point in time and what seems to be solidified over the years in terms of the evidence that has built. Okay. So what are saturated fats? So technically it's a fatty acid that is classified as saturated or unsaturated. These are all fats based on its molecular structure. Every fatty acid from the mono to the poly to the saturated fat contain a chain of carbon and hydrogen atoms. So it all comes down to chemical structure. It's really interesting. Now, saturated fats themselves, they don't have any double bonds between their chain of carbon, so it allows more hydrogen atoms to be attached to the carbon atoms. And so this means that they're saturated with hydrogens. I'm sharing that information because I think it's interesting and maybe you care about that or not. But this is what dietitians learn when they go through their training. We learn this organic chemistry and see how this plays out in terms of our health. So saturated fats are they usually are solid at room temperature. Maybe you're familiar with that already. So it's found in a lot of our typically highest in our animal-based foods like beef and pork and poultry, but also butter and cheese and whole milk and then fatty cuts of meat, but also our tropical oils, including coconut and palm oil. So if you've ever seen coconut oil, which is sort of a trendy product now, on the shelf at the store, it's solid, right? It's like a big old solid jar of white saturated fat. A little bit more about saturated fats. They're not all metabolically identical. So I shared that earlier. They vary by chain length, but also food matrix, right? So coconut oil is different than whole milk, right? So because there's other things in whole milk, like calcium and protein, and maybe some other types of compounds like micronutrients, like vitamin D, if it's fortified. So it changes then what's really happening more so than just that it has saturated fat, right? So how does that have implications for our health? And that's when it gets really confusing for all of us. So this all matters, right, in the end. So dairy fat, butter, and red meat all have very different fatty acid profiles and nutrient composition. That's what I attempted to show you in the beginning. Different cuts of red meat may vary significantly in their fatty acid content. So these nuances matter, but at the end of the day, and this is what I think you're going to hear from me throughout today's time together, eating too much saturated fat at the end of the day is not recommended. And that's what these new dietary guidelines of Americans have confirmed in that 420-page document. The guidelines are helpful, of course, when they can be individualized. And we need the clinical judgment from a dietitian because only a dietitian can offer you medical nutrition therapy. Only a dietitian can help you understand based on your own unique circumstances, your own eating habits, what makes the most sense for you. These guidelines, again, they're really meant for the general population and really they inform public policy, but how do we tailor it in a more practical way to help you pursue your own health goals? So, for example, whole milk can definitely fit into a recommended healthy eating pattern, but and those are in the guidelines. However, a lot of people I work with, they don't care to consume whole milk. They may not consume milk at all. So how do we make sense of this? And again, only a dietitian can help you do that. Now, is all saturated fat bad, or is saturated fat bad? Not all. So decades of guidance, right? We're not just talking one study, decades of studies and also from the interpretation from food and nutrition experts stress the need to reduce saturated fat in the diet. There's no question. So experts vary based on how much that limit should be. So some organizations recommend less than 6% of the total calories we eat per day. Our dietary guidelines of Americans say 10%, less than 10%, no more than that. Now, I would be remiss as a dietitian to remind everybody that we want to follow a healthy eating pattern. So even if you reduce that saturated fat to that number, is that good enough for your health outcomes? I don't think so, right? We do want to focus on what the evidence consistently has shown, that when we eat a lot of whole plant foods like vegetables, fruits, legumes, which is our beans and our lentils, our nuts and our seeds, our whole grains, and then if we eat minimally processed fish and seafood and use vegetable oils in their preparation, while also at the same time, maybe not avoiding, but eating less red and processed meat, especially trying to avoid sugary drinks, trying to limit refined grains, and saturated fat is in that category, right? So overall, that's going to really promote our health outcomes. Why is that? Well, we've known also for probably over a decade now that research suggests that when we eat less saturated fat, this can help to reduce our risk for colorectal cancer. So anyone that I work with specifically that has been diagnosed with a colorectal cancer, I will also really tune into this and really target saturated fat in their diet and make sure they're not eating too much, because we do see that there might be a link here. But also at the same time, evidence suggests that lowering saturated fat while also replacing it. And that replacement matters because very often, and I was guilty of this early in practice, when we tell someone to cut something out, we got to follow up with what they're going to eat in its place, right? And in its place, we want something that's also going to be helpful and really add to that ability to improve overall outcomes. So we want to replace it with polyunsaturated fats. That's been shown to help reduce the incidence of cardiovascular disease. And reducing saturated fat for at least 2 years will reduce cardiovascular events by 17%. That's pretty significant and solid evidence. So we're going to stand by that. Now, a little bit more about saturated fat. Here's why they think it's problematic. They increase the bad type of cholesterol, LDL, or lousy cholesterol. That's what some people use to help them remember. It inhibits the activity of the LDL receptors, but also upregulates the synthesis of LDL particles. So that's how they know the mechanism of why saturated fats are problematic. There is some debate that what saturated fats do is increase the larger size LDL particles, which are a little less atherogenic. However, a greater overall number of LDLs of all sizes are what is linked with raising LDL and cardiovascular risk. So that's important, okay? There are suspected varied individual responses, and we know this about diet too. So some people may go over that 10% consistently, like the rest of the American public, and they don't see any impact on their LDL cholesterol, and that just speaks to individual variability too. There is a lot of active research, a lot of debate, a lot of public discourse, well, among nutrition professionals about whether or not there are specific foods that are considered more likely to increase the risk for raising LDL cholesterol and cardiovascular disease. So we got to stay tuned for that. Now, do we have to avoid it at all costs? If you know me, you know I'm a little permissive. That's probably why I work in oncology. And I'm grateful, right? So we don't need to be afraid of it. We're probably just going to work with it, right? And work within our limits. And again, a dietitian can help you decide how best to pursue that. However, over 80% of us already exceed the limit. So chances are, if you're in the audience today, you're in that category. You're probably over consuming saturated fats. So thinking about maybe steps to reduce that, and I'm going to address that in the next set of questions. All fats that we eat have several important functions. Now, we don't have a requirement for saturated fats. We could go down to 0% and live just perfectly healthy, by the way. But all fats that we eat supply us with energy, just like carbohydrates do. Fats provide essential fatty acids, so that's especially in our polyunsaturated fats, which are the omega-3 and the omega-6s. Our bodies can't make them, so we need to eat them. And then fats help to regulate hormones. They help to regulate body temperature. It kind of matters this time of year, right? They also support our immune function, how well our insulin works, and then also how well we absorb some of our nutrients, especially our fat-soluble vitamins like A, D, E, and K. So we don't want to fear fat, but we want to recognize maybe there are some choices that are better than others within an overall healthy lifestyle. Okay. Saturated fat can be reduced by taking a total diet approach, right? So as I'm sharing, like we don't want to see saturated fat and be afraid of it. I think we just want to know, work with it. And I'm going to get more specific about that next, okay? So this was from a really nice release from the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. It's kind of a fact check, and I actually didn't include it in the resources, so I will when I send this out to those of you who registered. It's a really great campaign that they're offering about some of our popular nutrition topics and some of our myths and misinformation to help really settle the score about what we know at the moment about some nutrients and health. So as it relates to what we know right now about saturated fat, this is broken down into 3 points. The amount, what we know, it's growing and it's developing, but we know that saturated fat is linked to lowering, reducing it is linked to lowering total cholesterol, LDL, and cardiovascular events. So we don't know, does that impact mortality or CHD events or stroke? So it probably makes a lot of sense for most of us anyway to reduce the saturated fat. If we replace it with polyunsaturated fat, this is still a developing area of research, but the experts are really convinced that this is the case, that when we replace it with polyunsaturated fat, this, and as part of a healthy eating pattern, this can reduce total cholesterol, total CVD events. But again, we don't really know if it matters for mortality. And I guess that matters for most people, right? But to know that you can help yourself to reduce cardiovascular events and total cholesterol as well as the LDL is important. Now, where there's a little bit of discussion and a little bit of need for more information is the source of the saturated fat. So which specific foods, right? So we don't have a lot of evidence that shows that dairy products increase the risk for cardiovascular disease. While we know that when we lower red and processed meat, this is associated with lowering the risk for cardiovascular disease. So that's where we're still just kind of talking it out, working it out. The experts are researching this, and we're going to just, again, wait and see if there's more convincing data that will come out about specific foods that have saturated fats. Okay, so stay tuned. That'll be like the Ask the Dietitian of 2027 if we're all still here. All right, so the bottom line. Let's make sense of this. I love this graphic. It just streamlines it, makes it helpful for all of us to understand. We want to eat more because most of us are eating too much saturated fat. We want to limit them, but in their place, can we eat more mono and polyunsaturated fats? So you see basically right here in front of you, it's very clear what we want to eat more, what we want to limit, and what we want to try to avoid as much as possible. So those trans fats are now banned from the food supply. They do still linger and they still do occur naturally in some of our food sources. But when we have fried foods, when we have highly processed foods, sometimes that's where some of our trans fats show up. So if we can avoid them, because they tend to be even worse than saturated fats, by the way. So if we can avoid them as much as possible, that's one thing to really address. If you notice when you're looking at these pictures, oh, I eat a lot of the things at the very bottom, definitely consult with me. I can help you out. Okay. All right. So let's move on to the next questions. How much is okay? Right. So I said, like, I'm permissive. There probably is just a limit, and let's work with that limit. I want to explore that next. What are the biggest food items to avoid? I sort of already mentioned them, but we'll reiterate that here too. And then how to do it. That's my favorite part about what I do for a living is the how to. So how much is okay? So the experts all agree less than 10% of total daily calories, and that is pretty much international as well. Other health agencies around the world typically set a limit at less than 10% of total daily calories. So just for your information, not that I expect you to really understand this and apply it in your day-to-day life, this is my job. Each gram of fat contains 9 calories. So if you take the amount of calories you need and multiply by 0.10, because that's 10% of your daily calorie intake, that's the total amount of calories you're going to get from saturated fat, and then you divide it by 9. And so that gives you the grams of fat per day. Okay, so I've broken it down for you very quickly, and I can, again, do this for you if we work one-on-one, but the grams of saturated fat according to the number of calories that are less than 10%. So for 1,500 calories, that's less 16% or less, okay, and then accordingly. Now, fortunately, we have this good old nutrition facts panel, which is very confusing. But if it's on your radar and you're worried about saturated fat, we can look towards that label for some guidance. Okay, so this particular product is 1.5 grams of saturated fat in the serving size of 1.5 cups. Maybe you have half a cup. Maybe you have 3 cups. You have to do the math, right? But this 1.5 is, let's say we're limiting ourselves to 16 grams per day. So 1.5 of our 16. And you can even do the math further to see how much that is. In a 2,000 calorie diet, it's 8% of what you would want to try to limit within the day. Hopefully that makes sense. Okay. But the percent daily value applies to a 2,000 calorie diet. Some of us are not eating 2,000 calories. So that percent daily value is not helpful then. Okay. And that should be another Ask the Dietitian. How do you read a nutrition facts panel? But importantly, what the nutrition facts panel helps you do is identify how much saturated fat. And now you're seeing like, okay, 1.5 doesn't sound like too much because that's 1.5 cups. That's a decent serving size. And maybe I really like this particular product and I don't want to give it up. 1.5, I can make that work in my total day. On the other hand, you might look at a product like this and compare it with another product that's sort of similar, but maybe has less saturated fat in it. And you're willing to make that substitution and you're thinking, okay, this is helpful because I've just reduced it in this little amount, making the substitution, and I'm going to make it work for me. You get the point here. You kind of get to use this to make this more doable for you in a much more meaningful and practical way. Okay. So this is a nice little breakdown of the saturated fat and some of our food choices and the servings, serving size for each, right? So a tablespoon of butter is about 7 grams of saturated fat. Yikes. So on a 22-gram day, if you're eating 2,000 calories, that's a third. But then you see the list goes on and on here. Just as a little reminder, some experts like to use our hand as a guide. So if you take the tip of your thumb, that's a teaspoon. So you can, hopefully you're all kind of holding up your thumb when looking at it. That's a teaspoon. Your entire thumb plus your thumbnail is a tablespoon. Okay, so as you're thinking about spreading butter on your toast or maybe like over your baked potato, now you can sort of look at that for yourself and see to get another understanding as well. Okay, because this is a way to work with saturated fat too. Maybe you only want a teaspoon instead of a full tablespoon, and right there you reduced it. Okay. Now, this is from our Dietary Guidelines of Americans from 2020 to 2025. So I pulled this data from here, which I'm going to guess without reading through our new iteration that it's pretty similar. But this is where Americans get our saturated fat in our diet. So primarily, I don't know if this surprises anyone, but it's from our sandwiches based on surveys and reports. And within sandwiches, it's a lot of our breakfast sandwiches you see, but even like burritos and tacos, I guess they classify as a sandwich, but burgers, and you see chicken and turkey sandwiches. So that's where we tend to, that tends to add up. Desserts and sweet snacks, that's not a surprise to me, right? So ice cream, brownies, cookies. This is where we tend to, it all adds up quickly. But I just listed our top 5 sources. So sandwiches, desserts, sweet snacks, rice and grain mixed dishes, high fat milk and high full fat yogurt, and then also pizza. What a bummer. But that's where we're getting our saturated fat. So how do we reduce saturated fat in our diet? Because we're all, 80% of us are eating too much of it. I would say like, think of, I've already given you some ideas of where we find saturated fat. Think about, you do your own self inventory. Where are you getting your saturated fat? Like, where do you agree you can reduce it? And maybe it's not eliminate it. Maybe it's just reduce it. You could also replace. And a lot of people prefer this method. I do too, because when we replace it, if we're using those healthier unsaturated fats, specifically polyunsaturated fats, then we're really going to maximize the benefit, right? So these are just some examples here, using olive oil or avocado oil instead of butter or stick margarine. Plenty of ways to cook with it, believe it or not. So you're going to pick and choose if you prefer. Snack on nuts instead of full fat cheese. Choose seafood for dinner, maybe once or twice a week, or replace it instead, especially if you go out to eat. Lean cuts of bean or pork, lean ground meat. Prepare proteins without frying them, or you can braise them or poach them, right? Really great this time of year to still give it great flavor, but without the extra saturated fats. Double up on veggies in a stir fry. That's right up a dietitian's alley. And what that does is it can potentially displace the amount of meat that you eat, especially if it's high in saturated fat. I love the idea of using beans or lentils or even vegetables like mushrooms This is a great way to get kind of that mouthfeel while reducing some of the ground meat in your recipes. So I've seen that successfully done in things like a bolognese or like a taco or meatloaf. The sky's the limit. A burger, you can swap out some of the ground meat with some of those vegetables, right? And with some of those beans and lentils. Fruit for dessert is always a great option, right? Nutrition, I like addition rather than subtraction. Next set of questions, are some saturated fats better than others, or are they all bad for you? So are there differences? So within the saturated fats, there are short, medium, and long chain fatty acids. Short chain fatty acids are mostly produced in the colon from what we eat. Did you know that? Medium chain fatty acids, which you might have heard of these, palm kernel, coconut oil, and in some of our dairy products. And then we have our long chain fatty acids, and they're found in palm oil, lard, dairy, and beef. There is some research that suggests that the long chains are the most problematic in terms of how they increase our risk for heart disease, while short and medium chain fatty acids have a neutral effect. And you might have heard that, and especially in an advertisement that's trying to sell coconut oil, or a wellness influencer who's trying to gain your subscription or your like, or something else, who is using coconut oil in some sort of vegan baked good. So now I want to set the record straight. Okay. We don't just eat, first of all, coconut oil. If you remember from the beginning, not only is it mostly saturated fat, but it's not only medium chains, it's also has long chains in it, right? If you eat pure medium chain fats, that's different. There are purified forms of that we could get it from a lab or some are over the counter. But coconut oil is such a mixed bag, right? And what are you using the coconut oil with? Are you baking it into something sugary? It changes. It totally changes the outcome, right? So keep that in mind, because that's a reductionist way of thinking of things. We don't just eat medium chain fats. We don't just eat long chain fats. We eat a mix of them in a mix of foods, right? So that's why things get complicated. But if we really stick to the bottom line, then we're going to do better for ourselves. So we know that the evidence supports this. And again, the Dietary Guidelines of Americans that were just released confirm this. When we eat fats, we really want to focus on our vegetable sources that are unsaturated. That's encouraged, even over plant sources of saturated fat like coconut oil. They should be limited. Okay, so in their place, we want to eat the mono and especially the polyunsaturated fats. Okay, moving on. What's the best oil to cook with? I'm glad someone asked this. So not really about saturated fats, but we'll go with it. So polyunsaturated fats have more potential to lower the LDL cholesterol. I've been saying that all along, and they have stronger anti-inflammatory properties. So canola and grapeseed oil, and some of you may be gasping right now, are sources of polyunsaturated fats. They're great choices for cooking. And all of our nutrition and food experts have repeated this over the years. Flaxseed oil is very high in omega-3 fats. That's an essential fatty acid or group of them, and has anti-inflammatory properties. So it's a really great choice. Also, ground flax seeds are a great choice too. But it's not recommended to use in cooking because it's very delicate, right? So cooking will quickly oxidize the types of fats that are in flaxseed oil. So it's recommended to use it really at the table, maybe in a vinaigrette with another mixed oil. Some people do that with their vinaigrette. They use more than one type of oil in it to get kind of different flavors. I like that idea. But we don't really want to cook with flaxseed oil. Extra virgin olive oil and avocado oils are all really great choices. Avocado oil tends to have a higher smoke point. So if you're really, really ramping up that temperature, you might want to go with avocado oil. However, some high quality, fresh extra virgin olive oils retain a lot of antioxidants that protect that oil from breaking down and becoming oxidized, even when we cook it in high temperatures. So be confident if the oils in your kitchen are a mix of these that you see on the slide, that you're choosing some of the best oils you can. Now, are seed oils bad for you? Because I said it. I said some seed oils. How dare I? They're not bad for us. And I want to take a moment to explain why. So evidence shows, we know this, when we eat more unsaturated fats, we have better health outcomes. Seed oils contain mostly unsaturated fats in the form of poly and mono unsaturated versions. This is a nice review. It gives us a lot of confidence, but they followed for 33 years. The researchers followed over 2,200,000 people. And those people who ate the highest amount of plant-based oils, including those seed oils, they had a lower risk of dying during the study. So probably not the seed oils. Also, in that same study, replacing 2 teaspoons of butter with a plant-based oil every day was linked with a 17% lower risk of early death. Sign me up for all those things, right? So we don't want to worry about seed oils. It sounds like they're okay for us, right? And when the researchers took this study even further, they broke it down. They looked at the different oil types, and they looked at canola, they looked at soybean, and then they looked at olive oil separately. The benefit was true across the board. So it's not like one is better than the other necessarily. They found that this was confirmed through this research study. Pretty good evidence, right? Now, some of you may be familiar with hexane, and that's what the question is about seed oils. So let me take a moment to explain a little bit more about that. Extra virgin olive oil and finishing oils are typically extracted mechanically, but others are extracted using hexane, or sometimes they'll use a combination of mechanical and hexane. So a lot of our seed oils use hexane to get the oil out of the seed. Hexane in the oil evaporates after an oil is extracted. So very little hexane remains behind, very little, like at levels that we don't need to worry about. And that's been confirmed through research. Now, when we cook the oil, it also causes more evaporation of the hexane. Is hexane dangerous? Absolutely it is. I would never deny that. In the gas form, right? But not in the liquid form that we get in oils, and not in the amounts, the minuscule amounts that we get from our oils. So it pales in comparison with the amount that is sometimes ingested in the gas form for people who work in environments where hexane is being used, like a shoe factory. Like hexane is very often used to make shoe glue. So that's where we see the problem. So the problem with hexane, just like a lot of other things in nutrition, is that the dose is the poison. It's the excessive amount that we might get exposed to, and even in different forms, that seem to be problematic. If we're just going about our day-to-day life, eating relatively healthy and using these seed oils, we have nothing to worry about. Okay. If you're still not convinced that's not enough, I understand and I get it. You could use an organic oil, because organic oils and USDA certified organic, they can't use hexane. So if that gives you that little bit of extra comfort, go for it. I'm all for that. Okay. And you probably can source that pretty easily at most grocery stores. Oh, take a deep breath. Okay. Back to oils. So what I would be remiss if I didn't bring this up too. We want to protect our oils. We want to store them away from heat and light. Those things damage oils. You can store most of them in the refrigerator. I often get made fun of for doing this. The oils will solidify because there are some because of the properties, right? They're a mix of different fatty acids, so they will become cloudy. They may solidify. The quality or the taste of the oil doesn't get altered. And then if you're planning to cook with it, or maybe make a vinaigrette, you just pull it out. You gotta let it kind of sit for a little bit, get to room temperature. It's not going to influence the quality of the oil, the taste of the oil, the nutritional properties of the oil. And just a reminder, what are you using your oils for? So if you're cooking, what are you cooking the oils with, right? And think about the whole package. It's always important to do that, right? So if you're worried about your cooking oil, I want you to also take the next step and think more about, what am I eating that I'm cooking the oils in, right? So if we're roasting some vegetables, great. If we're stirring it into our whole grains because it needs a little flavor, or if we're marinating some of our proteins, maybe it's chicken, maybe it's tofu. If we're using that, we're going to probably, and designing our plate to look like the image you see on the screen, we're probably doing the best we can. Okay. But that goes beyond just worrying about the cooking oil. Okay. Next question. I'm so confused with this. You're not alone. You came to the right place. Any guidance is greatly appreciated. I am so grateful for you for asking me this question. I make my own ghee at home, and I just want to make sure I'm doing it right. So ghee is clarified butter. It's used in a lot of traditional Indian cooking recipes. It has milk solids and water that's removed. That's how you make it, and it leads to a higher concentration of saturated fats than does butter. That's probably why it has ridiculous flavor. It's delicious if you haven't had it yet. It's absolutely delicious. But in comparison to butter, a teaspoon is about 45 calories, 5 grams of fat, and 3 grams of saturated fat. Butter has a little bit less than that. So I didn't put that up here, but just for your information, there's a little bit more. It may not be significantly more for you to be worried about it. But it's just sort of for your information, okay? So that if we're trying to follow those guidelines for grams of saturated fat per day, now you have that information for yourself. So what's in ghee? It's mostly saturated. There are some mono and polyunsaturated fats in it as well. Good to know. It's a mixed bag. But experts advise we're not over consuming saturated fats. Ghee is in that category because it's mostly a saturated fat. Can it fit into guidelines? Absolutely it can. But don't just assume it's a healthy food, right? We still want to put limits on it, just like we might put limits on butter. But ghee has such amazing flavor. And you're making it yourself. I encourage you to continue to do that, but just maybe potentially be mindful. Where can you allow ghee to fit within your day, within those limits? Okay. Hopefully I'm explaining that okay, so that it's helpful for you. Okay. What are the main do's and don'ts? This is sort of to wrap up the presentation today. We talked a lot about saturated fat. We talked a lot about oils. Even seed oils came up in the conversation. I don't want you to get distracted. Okay. If you came here because you want to help yourself and you think food and nutrition is one way to do that, you're right. So I want you to do what the evidence has convincingly shown us over decades of time. Do as many things as you can as these. Okay. Pursue a healthy weight. Now that's going to be different things for everybody. And how do we define a healthy weight? That definitely requires the interpretation of a healthcare provider like a dietitian, because we can help you understand how to make sense of what a healthy weight is for you. Be physically active. Probably one of the most important things, if not the most important thing to do if you've been diagnosed with cancer. Eat a diet rich in whole grains, vegetables, fruits, and beans, as minimally processed as possible. As much as possible, okay? Limit consumption of fast foods and other highly processed foods that are high in fat, especially now you see saturated fat seems to be problematic, but sugary beverages, refined starches or carbohydrates, refined grains, they seem to be something that Americans eat a lot of. And if we can minimize them, we're taking it in the right direction. Also, we want to limit consumption of red meat and processed meat. The new dietary guidelines of Americans may not make that very clear for you based on the messaging that is on the website in that inverted upside down food guide pyramid. It seems to sort of promote a lot of red meat. Experts have advised for a long time now that we want to choose lean cuts of red meat, but then also to try to really reduce red meat to less than 18 ounces of cooked red meat per week. And that's recommended for all cancer survivors. Limit consumption of sugary drinks, limit alcohol consumption. Very interestingly, the dietary guidelines of Americans for 2025 to 2030 have really missed the mark in terms of setting a limit on alcohol consumption. We know in the world of oncology nutrition that alcohol is problematic, and we do want to keep limits. So we want to limit alcohol consumption as much as possible. Don't use supplements for cancer prevention. They don't seem to pan out. They don't seem to offer any benefit for our survivors. And a lot of this stuff is in the terminology of prevention, but if you've been diagnosed, try to follow as much of these guidelines as you can. Okay, so these are the resources I have to share. If you click on these links when you get the slides, it'll bring you over to what I think are the best nutrition guidelines to follow, especially if you've been diagnosed with cancer. A little bit more about cooking oils. I think this is from Ohio State. So if you're like more interested in seeing like the types of oils and why they're recommended for what and how to use them, that might be right up your alley. The American Heart Association, they have for a long time now recommended that we eat less than 6% of our calories from saturated fat. They're really sort of on that campaign. So if you want to learn more about that, please take a look at that link. It's really helpful. I find their website to be very helpful and practical. They have things like this, which I feel like I want to borrow. Love it, limit, lose it. I love it. So it just goes through very practical graphics and choices within each of the types of fats and categories that we want to minimize and just try to avoid altogether. Okay. And the ones to emphasize, again, this idea of addition versus subtraction. Now, sometimes people are use the argument that, well, internationally, like in Europe, they eat differently. They have different foods. So what I thought I would do is include this link about hexane from the European Food Information Council. But that website, the European Food Information Council, is a very helpful website as well. If you're looking to see like what else is happening in the world, what other types of guidelines do other countries follow, and you might be surprised, it's pretty similar and in line with what we do here. So you might find that website helpful as well. Now, I went over by 1 minute. Sorry. So thanks for being here. Join us, if you will, on February 6th, same time, 1 o'clock. We are going to explore one of my favorite subject matters in oncology nutrition. It's all about plant proteins. I would have liked to seen that emphasized in the dietary guidelines, maybe not the red meat and beef tallow, but plant proteins and how beneficial they might be. I'd love to hear all of your great questions and hope to provide some helpful answers for you in February. So I hope you'll join me then. I'm going to stop my share and do what I'm told from Lisa.
Thank you, Lori. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording.